Bismillah walhamdulillah. Salatu wassalamu ala rasulillah. Wa ala alihi wa ashabihi wa man walahu wa ba'd. Allahumma alimna ma yanfa'una wa anfa'na bima 'allamtana wa zidna ilman ya rabbil alameen. Allah, teach us what will benefit us with what you've taught us, and increase us in knowledge, O Lord of the worlds. Alhamdulillah, we are on the 7th session of Ḥā'iyya ibn Abi Dāwūd, and we will be continuing from the 21st line of the poem. So today is the 7th of November. I foresee that we have at least 2 or 3 more sessions after this one, and we will talk about today. We'll talk about Qadr, which is the 6th pillar of Islam, or should I say the 6th fundamental of the Islamic faith. So the author, rahmatullahi alayhi, he says, وَبِالْقَدْرِ الْمَقْدُورِ أَيْقٍ فَإِنَّهُ دَعَامَةُ أو دعامة عقد الدين والدين أفيح. Of the preordained decree, be certain and affirm. It is a pillar of faith on which our religion is firm. So this stanza represents or affirms the 6th pillar of faith, or the 6th fundamental of faith, which is belief in predestination, or Qadr. As is stated in the well-known Hadith of Jibreel, الإيمان أن تؤمن بالله وملائكته وكتبه ورسله واليوم الآخر وبالقدر خيره وشره. Faith is to believe in Allah and His angels and His books and His messengers and the last day, and Qadr, it's good and it's bad. In another narration, حلوه ومره, it's sweet and it's bitter. In other words, without belief in Qadr, true monotheism is incomplete. It is narrated from Abdullah ibn Abbas that he said, Al-Qadaru nizamu at-tawheed. فَمَنْ وَحَّدَ اللَّهَ وَكَذَّبَ بِالْقَدَرِ فَقَدْ نَقَضَ تَكْذِيبُهُ تَوْحِيدَهُ. He, radiyallahu anhu, he said, Qadr is the structure of monotheism. Whoever believes in Allah's oneness and denies Qadr has breached his tawheed. In other words, without belief in Qadr, you can't be a muwahhid. Rejecting Qadr is tantamount to rejecting Allah, as Imam Ahmad is reported to have said. So this innovation of rejecting Qadr was the second innovation to arise in the Ummah after the innovation of the Khawarij. So this is one of the reasons why Ibn Abi Dawud is mentioning that. As we said, if somebody says, what are the original books of Aqīda? The original books of Aqīda are the Quran and the books of Hadith. And then when people strayed from the clear-cut texts of the Book of Allah and the Hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, scholars started to clarify where they had went wrong and what texts of the Quran and the Sunnah applied to the issues that they had brought up. And so one of the first deviations from the meanings of the texts was the denial of Qadr, the denial that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has preordained things to happen. Now, there's a lot that can be said about this issue. And the question of free will versus determinism is a deeper philosophical issue, right? It cuts across religious traditions, scientific discourse, but for us as Muslims, it is a core tenet of our faith. And there have been Islamicate groups that have tried to reformulate the idea of Qadr in order to deal with the philosophies or knowledge of their time. In reality, all of those have fallen short, and what we see is that the texts of the Quran and the Sunnah in their broadest implications and in their specific evidences support the idea that we're going to talk about today. So what are we going to talk about today? We're going to talk a little bit about the idea of divine decree. Like, what is it as a pillar of Islamic faith? We're going to talk a little bit about human agency. As human beings, do we have the ability to make choices or not? How do we, when we talk about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we're talking about someone who, as we have confirmed before, we are unable to know except what he has told us about himself. But we know that he is absolute in knowledge and absolute in power. How do we reconcile that with the idea of human responsibility? Where do we strike a balance between those who are determinists and say that everything that happens has already been predetermined, there is no choice, and those who are free will absolutists who say that you make all of your own decisions, God has no say in the matter? So we're going to talk a little bit about what are the different levels of Qadr, how does that mesh with some modern scientific and philosophical perspectives, and how do we maintain the orthodox Islamic position that affirms both the divine sovereignty of Allah, but also the meaningful human agency that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us that we have in the Quran, by avoiding the pitfalls of denying Allah's divine decree or negating human responsibility. So let's talk a little bit about the Islamic perspectives of predestination. When we look at all of the texts of the Quran and the Sunnah, we know that the Quran is replete with many different verses that clarify for us the idea of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's Qadr and his attributes that are connected to it. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in Surah Al-Qamar, verse 49, Inna kulla shay'in khalaqnahu bi qadar. Indeed, everything we created it with Qadr. He subhanahu wa ta'ala says in Surah Al-Ahzab, وَمَا كَانَ عَلَى النَّبِيِّ مِنْ حَرَجٍ فِيمَا فَرَضَ اللَّهُ لَهُ سُنَّةَ اللَّهِ فِي الَّذِينَ خَلَوْا مِنْ قَبْلُ وَكَانَ أَمْرُ اللَّهِ قَدَرًا مَقْدُورًا. There is no harm on the Prophet in anything that he has mandated for him or is granted him, a sunnah of Allah in those that have come before, and God's command or God's affair was a measured decision. He also says in Surah At-Takwir, وَمَا تَشَاءُونَ إِلَّا أَن يَشَاءَ اللَّهُ رَبُّ الْعَالَمِينَ. And you do not will except that Allah, the Lord of the worlds, wills. He subhanahu wa ta'ala describes himself by saying, الَّذِي خَلَقَ فَسَوَّى وَالَّذِي قَدَّرَ فَهَدَى. In Surah Al-A'la, it is he who is created and formed, and he who has determined and guided. When Musa alayhi salam comes to the miqat, the demarcation line of the promised appointment that he's to meet Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala at Mount Tur, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, ثُمَّ جِئْتَ عَلَى قَدَرٍ يَا مُوسَى. You have come upon a predetermined time. So everything in creation has been determined previously. It's narrated Ibn Abbas radiallahu anhu. He said, كُلُّ شَيْءٍ بِقَدَرٍ حَتَّى وَضَعَكَ يَدَكَ عَلَى خَدِّكَ. Everything has been predetermined, even your hand being placed on your face, even your hand being placed in your cheek. Neither does وَمَا تَسْقُطُ مِنْ وَرَقَةٍ إِلَّا يَعْلَمُهَا. A leaf does not fall except that he knows it. It's narrated in Sahih Muslim that the Prophet ﷺ said, كُلُّ شَيْءٍ بِقَدَرٍ حَتَّى الْعَجْزِ وَالْكَيْسِ. Everything is by predetermination, even incapacity and intelligence. If that is the case, then how do we conceptualize the idea of Qadr? Ahl Sunnah say there are 4 levels of Qadr, of predetermination. Number 1 is our faith in Allah's eternal knowledge, that He has encompassed everything in knowledge, that He knows what was and what will be, and what was not. If it had happened, how it would have been. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in Surah Al-Anfal, وَلَوْ عَلِمَ اللَّهُ فِيهِمْ خَيْرًا لَأَسْمَعَهُمْ وَلَوْ أَسْمَعَهُمْ لَتَوَلَّوْا وَهُمْ مُعْرِضُونَ. Speaking about the disbelievers that were misguided, and if Allah had known in them good, He would have let them hear. And if He had let them hear, then they would have turned back and fled, or turned back and rejected what was heard. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala also says in Surah Saba, Alhamdulillah alladhi lahu ma fi as-samawati wa ma fi al-ard wa lahu al-hamdu fi al-akhirah wa huwa al-hakim al-khabir. يعلم ما يلج في الأرض وما يخرج منها وما ينزل من السماء وما يعرج فيها وهو الرحيم الغفور. All praise is due to Allah, to whom belongs what is in the heavens and what is in the earth. To Him is all praise in the end, and He is the wise and the well-informed. He knows that which goes in the earth and that which exits it, that which comes down from the sky and that which arises in it, and He is the most merciful and the most forgiving. On the tongue of Luqman alayhi salam, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, يَا بُنَيَّ إِنَّهَا إِن تَكُ مِثْقَالَ حَبَّةٍ مِّنْ خَرْدَلٍ فَتَكُنْ فِي صَخْرَةٍ أَوْ فِي السَّمَاوَاتِ أَوْ فِي الْأَرْضِ يَأْتِ بِهَا اللَّهُ إِنَّ اللَّهَ لَطِيفٌ خَبِيرٌ. Oh, my dear son, if there is but a seed of mustard that is under a rock or in the heavens or in the earth, Allah will bring it forth. He is subtle and well-informed. يَعْلَمُ مَا فِي الْبَرِّ وَالْبَحْرِ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in Surah Al-An'am, He knows that which is in the land and in the sea. وَمَا تَسْقُطُ مِنْ وَرَقَةٍ إِلَّا يَعْلَمُهَا. And never does a leaf fall except that He knows it. وَلَا حَبَّةٍ فِي ظُلُمَاتِ الْأَرْضِ. Nor a seed in the depths of the earth. وَلَا رَطْبٍ وَلَا يَابِسٍ إِلَّا فِي كِتَابٍ مُبِينٍ. Nor anything moist or dry except that it is in a clear book. He subhanahu wa ta'ala also says in Surah Ali Imran, إِنَّ اللَّهَ لَا يَخْفَى عَلَيْهِ شَيْءٌ فِي الْأَرْضِ وَلَا فِي السَّمَاءِ. Indeed, nothing is hidden from Allah in the heavens or in the earth. In the earth or in the heavens. وَاللَّهُ عَلِيمٌ بِذَاتِ الصُّدُورِ. He says later in the same surah, Allah is knowledgeable of that which is in the chests. So there is nothing in creation except that Allah knows it and He has power over it. And what He knows about the creation, He subhanahu wa ta'ala had written. So we believe that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, one of the first things that He created was the pen. And He told it right. And after after it was created, said, what shall I write? He said, write everything that is happening until the day of judgment. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَكُلُّ شَيْءٍ فَعَلُوهُ فِي الزُّبُرِ وَكُلُّ صَغِيرٍ وَكَبِيرٍ مُسْتَطَرٍ. In Surah Al-Qamar, everything that they have said everything that they have done is written in scrolls. Every small and everything big has been delineated. He also says in Surah Al-Hajj, أَلَمْ تَعْلَمْ أَنَّ اللَّهَ يَعْلَمُ مَا فِي السَّمَاءِ وَمَا فِي السَّمَاءِ وَالْأَرْضِ إِنَّ ذَلِكَ فِي كِتَابٍ إِنَّ ذَلِكَ عَلَى اللَّهِ يَسِيرٌ. Surah Al-Hajj, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, do you not know that Allah knows what is in the heavens and the earth? Indeed, that is in a book. Indeed, that is upon Allah easy. He subhanahu wa ta'ala also says in Surah Al-Hadid, مَا أَصَابَ مِن مُصِيبَةٍ فِي الْأَرْضِ وَلَا فِي أَنفُسِكُمْ إِلَّا فِي كِتَابٍ مِّن قَبْلِ أَن نَّبْرَأَهَا إِنَّ ذَلِكَ عَلَى اللَّهِ يَسِيرٌ. Never does an affliction befall in the earth or in yourselves, except that it is in a book before it occurs. Indeed, that is for Allah easy. It's also narrated from Abdullah ibn Amr ibn al-As radiyallahu anhu that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, كتب الله مقادير الخلائق قبل أن يخلق السماوات والأرض ب50 ألف سنة وعرشه على الماء. Sahih Muslim. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, indeed, Allah wrote the predetermined, the preordainment of creation before He created the heavens and the earth 50,000 years before, and His throne was over water. I mentioned the hadith of the qalam. That's the hadith of Ubadah ibn Samit. إن أول ما خلق الله القلم قال له اكتب فجرى بتلك الساعة بما هو كائن إلى يوم القيامة. In the Musnad of Imam Ahmad, as well as Tirmidhi, indeed, the first thing that Allah created was the pen, and what He said to it, write, and so it started to write from that moment in time until that which will be until the Day of Judgment. So we believe that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has perfect knowledge, and that the perfect knowledge that He has about our creation, He has written down. And then we believe that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has perfect power and thus perfect will. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants things to happen and wills them into existence. Inna Allah yaf'alu ma yasha. Surah Al-Hajj, Allah does what He wills. وَمَا تَشَاءُونَ إِلَّا إِن يَشَاءَ اللَّهُ. Surah Al-Insan. Never do you will something except that Allah wills it. وَمَا تَشَاءُونَ إِلَّا إِن يَشَاءَ اللَّهُ رَبُّ الْعَالَمِينَ. Surah Al-Takwir. Nor do you will something except that Allah, the Lord of the world, wills it. مَنْ ذَا الَّذِي يَشْفَعُ عِنْدَهُ إِلَّا بِإِذْنِهِ. Surah Al-Baqarah, Ayat Al-Kursi. Who is it that can intercede with Him except by His permission? He sallallahu alaihi wasallam said in the hadith narrated by Tirmidhi from Ibn Abbas, وَاعْلَمْ أَنَّ الْأُمَّةَ لَوْ اجْتَمَعَتْ عَلَى أَن يَنْفَعُوكَ بِشَيْءٍ لَمْ يَنْفَعُوكَ إِلَّا بِشَيْءٍ كَتَبَهُ اللَّهُ لَكَ. Know that if the entire nation were to gather to benefit you with something, they would not be able to benefit you with anything unless Allah had written it. وَلَوْ اجْتَمَعُوا عَلَى أَن يَضُرُّوكَ بِشَيْءٍ لَنْ يَضُرُّوكَ إِلَّا بِشَيْءٍ كَتَبَهُ اللَّهُ عَلَيْكَ. And know that if they were to gather to harm you with anything, they would not be able to harm you with anything except that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had written it upon you. رُفِعَتِ الْأَقْلَامُ وَجَفَّتِ الصُّحُفُ. The pens have lifted and the pages have dried. Therefore, we believe that after the knowledge of Allah and the knowledge of Qadr, the writing of that Qadr, the intention to bring it into existence, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala then brings it into existence. By how? By creating it. Allahu khaliqu kulli shay. Allahu khaliqu kulli shay. Allah is the creator of all things. Surah Az-Zumar. وَاللَّهُ خَلَقَكُمْ وَمَا تَعْمَلُونَ. Allah has created you and that which you do. So everything that we do, everything that we are and we do has been created. We are in a closed system, and keep that term in mind. We're in a closed system. We only know about ourselves in this system what we have discovered. And we only know about Allah in this system what He has told us about Himself. This is a very important point. So these levels of our iman in Qadr, that we believe in Allah's knowledge, we believe in the writing of Allah's knowledge, that we believe that He wills it and then He creates it. What this does is this gives us a framework through which to start to understand some of Qadr. Now, we mentioned the Hadith. Excuse me. We mentioned in the Hadith of Abdullah ibn Abbas, رُفِعَتِ الْأَقْلَامُ وَجَفَّتِ الصُّحُفُ. The pens have been lifted and the ink has dried. So, is there a benefit from actually attempting to do anything? If we are mandated to have human agency and to be responsible for our actions, how do we reconcile that with the idea of Qadr? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ordered us to live, to seek out our sustenance, to take care of ourselves in life, to seek after that which is going to benefit us. He says in Surah Al-Mulk, فَامْشُوا فِي مَنَاكِبِهَا وَكُلُوا مِنْ رِزْقِهِ. Walk in its, or traverse in its paths and eat from its sustenance. Surah Al-Jumu'ah, فَإِذَا قُضِيَتِ الصَّلَاةُ فَانْتَشِرُوا فِي الْأَرْضِ وَابْتَغُوا مِنْ فَضْلِ اللَّهِ. So when the prayer is finished, then spread out in the earth and seek from the bounty of Allah. So in about Hajj, he says in Surah Al-Baqarah, وَتَزَوَّدُوا فَإِنَّ خَيْرَ الزَّادِ التَّقْوَى. And take provisions because the best provision is taqwa. About jihad, he says in Surah Al-Anfal, وَأَعِدُّوا لَهُم مَّا اسْتَطَعْتُم مِّن قُوَّةٍ وَمِن رِّبَاطِ الْخَيْلِ تُرْهِبُونَ بِهِ عَدُوَّ اللَّهِ وَعَدُوَّكُمْ. And prepare for them what you can of power, of stabled horses, that you strike fear into the enemies of Allah and your enemies. When Maryam alayhi salam was giving birth, he ordered her to shake the palm tree that she was sitting under. وَهُزِّي إِلَيْكِ بِجِذْعِ النَّخْلَةِ تُسَاقِطُ عَلَيْكِ رُطَبًا جَنِيًّا. And shake the trunk of the tree. Fresh dates will fall upon you. Fresh, ripe dates will fall upon you. So, if you leave off what you were ordered to do, saying, I'm just going to rely upon what was predestined, this is how you end up in a bad situation. The Prophet ﷺ said about this, فَمَنْ وَجَدَ خَيْرًا فَلْيَحْمِدِ اللَّهِ وَمَنْ وَجَدَ غَيْرَ ذَلِكَ فَلَا يَلُومَنَّ إِلَّا نَفْسَهُ. Whoever finds good after his attempts to do good should praise Allah. And whoever finds other than that should blame no one but himself. So essentially, we are always faced with two choices in life: that which we can control and that which we cannot control. The things that we can control, we take to and make benefit of. The things that we cannot control, we don't fret over and we don't chase after. So how then are we to reconcile our How then are we to reconcile our belief in Qadr? How are we, making the most of our belief in Qadr? I want to give you an example that I think helps contextualize the 4 key concepts that we talked about. So these 4 levels of Iman and Qadr, we can summarize it like this. Allah knows all. He recorded that knowledge. He wills it to exist and wants the best for it. He creates it into existence. These are the 4 levels of Iman and Qadr that we were talking about. So inevitably, this is very difficult for us to understand at times. Because if we go back to our conversations about the other attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, what did we say? We said that there are some who denied the attributes of Allah because they did not recognize their ontological differences and their epistemological limitations. They did not understand that their mode of existence is different than the mode of existence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, although there is a common trait of existence between them. They did not realize that what they can know and definitively speak about is limited by what they have access to in this life, and you cannot use the realities of this life to determine the realities of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's life, although Allah is alive, huwa al-Hayyul Qayyum. Similarly, when we try to comprehend Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's knowledge, the extent of that knowledge, his will attached to that knowledge, and his creation of that, what he wills to bring into existence, we are using a finite mind to try and comprehend the infinite. We said similarly about the idea of seeing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. إنكم سترون ربكم لا تضاهون في رؤيته كما قال صلى الله عليه وسلم. Indeed, you will see your Lord. You will not have to stretch out your necks or strain yourselves to do so. كما ترون البدر, as you see the full moon. So the human eye can see the moon, can identify it, can know what it is, can recognize its beauty and magnificence and its loftiness and all of the other ideas that are related to that. But our eye cannot actually capture the reality of the moon. Similarly, if we are blessed with the ability when we enter Jannah, and we ask Allah for that, to be able to see Allah, which is what he has promised the believers, and the disbelievers are shielded from him on that day, then our sight of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would not be encompassing of his reality. وَلَا يُحِيطُونَ بِهِ عِلْمًا. They cannot encompass him in knowledge because we are finite. He is infinite. So all we can do is approximate. So how do we want to approximate the knowledge of Allah with regards to Qadr? How do we want to approximate the knowledge of Allah with regards to Qadr? Okay. So I want you to imagine that you enter into a garden and you're standing at the foot of a tree in that garden. And you hug the trunk of the tree and you start to climb up the tree. As you climb, in order for you to stay attached to the tree, you have to keep your face pressed to the tree, so you can't see anything while you're climbing. Your vision becomes impaired. You can no longer see all of the places that you reach to grab above you, on your sides. You might reach up and grab a branch that's firm and pull yourself up to the next level. You might reach yourself up and grab a branch that's flimsy, and either you pull it and you fall, or you pull it and you catch yourself, and then you determine a new path up the tree. Start over from that point. I'm not going to grab that. that's not helpful. That's flimsy. That's going to break. And then I make another choice. For those of you in marketing, you'll realize that what we're talking about is A/B testing. Climbing, like bouldering and everything, it's a long series of A/B tests. The only difference is, instead of being able to exactly plot your path up the tree, you're blindfolded. So imagine you're climbing this tree now, but you're blindfolded. You know that I'm hugging a tree. I'm climbing up the tree. I've got to climb up the tree. Something's coming. Let's say something's coming to get me. There are numerous choices that await you as you climb the tree. You know from the nature of climbing that there will be good choices and there will be bad choices. Those choices are yours to make. So you're in this garden, blindfolded, you in a tree, nothing else. In order for you to be safe, you have to climb that tree. Now, you can climb the tree and try and make the choices that you want. Or you realize that there's someone outside of the garden who's a spotter, who says, hey, I see you climbing the tree. Don't put your foot there. Instead, put your foot to the left. Don't grab that branch. It's flimsy. Instead, grab the branch that's below it. Now, you don't have to listen to the spotter. You can still make the choice to put your hands and feet and everywhere else, wherever you like. But the spotter is trying to guide you to make the best, safest, and most secure decisions for where you're going to put your hands and feet. Why? Because your spotter is outside of the garden. He knows and sees every single branch on that tree. In fact, it's his garden. He's the one that put it there. He wants you to get out, but he allows you to climb on your own if you want. So I want you to think about this example with regards to your personal decisions in life. Many times you might be making decisions, you might have circumstances that are in your life that you're unsure about, that you're uncertain about. You know the right thing to do. Sometimes you're deciding that you want to go another way. Sometimes you make a decision and then you pull back because you're just not that firm on that decision. Sometimes your spotter told you you need to make the decision, but you're not sure about it. Sometimes you're overconfident and absolute and head sure. My choices are my choices. And then you reach up and a branch snaps, or you slip and fall. It was your choice. But the one who owned the tree and put it in the garden and had you climb it knew all of the choices on that tree, placed you and the tree and all of the choices in front of you. So the fence around that garden, this is the circle of God's knowledge. He knows all. He has full knowledge of everything which is in this closed system. He has full knowledge of all of the branches. He spots us by sending us guidance, telling us where to make our feet firm, allowing us the ability to transcend beyond the garden, beyond the box, beyond whatever's containing us. So he created you, he created the tree, he created the garden. وَمَا تَشَاءُونَ إِلَّا إِن يَشَاءَ اللَّهُ رَبُّ الْعَالَمِينَ. وَمَا تَشَاءُونَ إِلَّا إِن يَشَاءَ اللَّهُ إِنَّ اللَّهَ كَانَ عَلِيمًا حَكِيمًا. Indeed, you do not wish except that Allah, the Lord of the world, wishes. And you do not will it except that Allah wills. Indeed, Allah is ever knowing and wise. So Qadr is like climbing a tree blindfolded. And this is the belief of Ahl Sunnah. Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah, they say that these four levels of Qadr are interconnected and they are essential for complete faith in Qadr. Your belief in Qadr is incomplete without affirming all four of these, because it's a comprehensive framework for how to understand how the defined decree operates. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not constrained by our constraints of knowledge. And He informs us from outside of the creation that we exist in to be able to give us guidance. So therefore, لِمَنْ شَاءَ مِنْكُمْ أَنْ يَسْتَقِيمَ وَمَا تَشَاءُونَ إِلَّا أَنْ يَشَاءَ اللَّهُ رَبُّ الْعَالَمِينَ. As we said, for whoever wishes for whomever amongst you wishes to take the right course, you do not will except that Allah wills, Lord of the world. So this single verse kind of encapsulates the delicate balance between human choice and divine sovereignty. لِمَنْ شَاءَ مِنْكُمْ أَنْ يَسْتَقِيمَ. Whoever wills amongst you to take a right course. So this is very explicit about human agency and the reality of human choice. And this directly refutes determinists who say that human beings are like leaves blown in the wind, or, choice is but an illusion. وَمَا تَشَاءُونَ إِلَّا أَنْ يَشَاءَ اللَّهُ رَبُّ الْعَالَمِينَ. And you do not will except that Allah wills. It establishes human will. It identifies it as real. But it says that it operates within a broader framework of divine will. And this counters the other deviation in this area, the deviation of the Qadariyya, the free will absolutists, who say that there's absolute human autonomy. In a hadith narrated from Ali radiallahu anhu, that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam was asked whether actions were preordained or newly initiated. Al-amru unuf. He sallallahu alaihi wasallam said they're preordained. So someone said, فَفِيمَ الْعَمَلُ, then why should we act? He said, اعْمَلُوا فَكُلٌّ مُيَسَّرٌ لِمَا خُلِقَ لَهُ. Act, for everyone is facilitated for what he was created for. So this shows that Qadr, or predestination, doesn't negate the importance of human action and striving. It means, excuse me, it means that when we look at these two things together, divine sovereignty, infinite knowledge, wisdom, power, and will, and limited and finite human knowledge, ability, and will, that reconciling these two requires that we understand that we as humans possess genuine choice and responsibility, while acknowledging that our will is subordinate to Allah's will. This is not a contradiction, but it reflects a complex reality of human existence within the rules of divine sovereignty. So we're not passive. We don't just receive what's happening to us passively, but we're also not completely independent actors. So one of the anecdotes that's mentioned on this issue, to show that we have real agency that is constricted by the laws that Allah has put on us, is that one of the Qadariyya, who was saying that, he can do anything, his full human autonomy, was teaching, and a Bedouin man, who were very straightforward and very close to the fitrah and very brash, heard him, and he said, أنت الذي تدعي أنك تفعل ما تشاء متى شئت وكيف شئت. You're the person who claims that he does what he wills, when he wills, how he wills. He said, yes. He said, وهل تستطيع أن تتغوط بدون أن تبول? He said, okay, well, can you defecate without urinating? There are certain things that are bound to happen. There are certain things that are natural laws that overcome us. This very simple anecdotal example is meant to show that if you were fully autonomous in all of your claims about free will, then you should be able to defecate without urinating. But we all know that that just doesn't happen because that's not how the human body works. So we as believers, we are encouraged to strive and take action and to trust in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's decree. Realizing that there are certain things that are beyond our comprehension, but that doesn't diminish the reality and the importance of doing right in the moment that we're in. Because let's tie this back to the idea of knowledge. We cannot change the past. We cannot know the future. Therefore, for the believer, the most important moment in their life is right now. And every single moment leads us to make a decision. In fact, every second that moves forward in time has us making a new decision. So if we were determinists, claiming that, we can if we were determinists, saying that humans have no agency, that we simply we're simply, leaves in the wind. We can't make any choices of our own. We're compelled in all of our actions and our speech. We have no genuine free will or choice. All of our actions are directly and solely attributed to God's power. We're purely passive entities. If we take this position, then, like the Jahmiyyah did, the Jahmiyyah claim that humans have no role in any of their actions. There's no human capacity or any human agency. The problem with this is that they only invoke determinism to justify their own wrongdoings. When anyone naturally does something well, they praise themselves or they attribute it to themselves. I was compelled to do this. That's why I did it. When they experience harm from others, they don't say, well, everything is from God. No, they say that person harmed me. I'm going to take them to court. I'm going to hold that person accountable, but I'm going to deny accountability for myself. So this inconsistency with accountability shows us that there's a certain impracticality of absolute determinism. It contradicts the verses of the Quran that we mentioned that affirm human choice. It negates the purpose of divine commands and prohibitions, al-amr wa nahi. What's the reason? What's the purpose of having haram and halal if there's no choice? You undermine the basis of human morality. And this simply conflicts with the reality of human experience and choice. So this pure determinism, denying human agency, is rejected. So overemphasizing divine power at the expense of human responsibility, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned that we have responsibility subordinate to his will, it creates an untenable theological, legal, and practical framework. We can't reconcile scripture lived experience and logical, rational, and moral choices. It doesn't work. There's another type of determinism, which it's like determinism light or impure determinism that was promoted by the Ash'aris. So they say that humans have power, but it's a limited form of power. It's an acquired power. They call it kasb, an acquisition. That power ultimately has no real effect on outcomes, but still, so it's essentially deterministic in practice. The key distinction between the two positions is the role of human agency. So the Jahmiyyah, they completely negate any human role in actions. And the Ash'aris, they try to preserve some semblance of human involvement through the doctrine of kasb. Now, some scholars have said this is simply a verbal, semantical differentiation. Terminologies and frameworks differ, but both schools essentially emphasize God's absolute control over human actions. Now, one of the stranger things that comes from this is the tendency of many people who hold deterministic views about Qadr to also be those who believe in things like the barakat and the karamat of awliya. Well, we believe in Ahl Sunnah Jama'ah, we believe in the karamat of awliya. We believe in the miracles of those who are close to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But those miracles are from Allah, not from other than them. One of those contradictions is seeking out people because of their barakah, asking them to ask Allah for you, asking the dead or those who are in their graves to ask Allah for you. Saying that as long as I don't attribute independence to this created being, it's not a problem. Am I saying everyone does that? No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying that is a contradiction of some. But it's a chief contradiction amongst determinists who will seek out that form of religious satisfaction when in reality none of that should matter. But it's paradoxical because essentially you can say, well, if I go and I make dua to a dead person and it's answered, well, it's from Allah anyway. So there's no problem with we doing that. But then we have all of the ayat and ahadith that forbid us from doing that because we're putting intermediaries and between us and Allah. So there's a connection between the idea of Qadr and the idea of Allah's attributes and the idea of Allah's right to be worshipped alone. And so in believing in Qadr, we don't want to be, determinists. The opposite side of the Jabriya were the Qadariya. And they essentially denied Qadr in part or in whole. So earliest Qadariya, they denied all four levels of predestination. Later Qadariya, who kind of culminated in the Mu'tazila, they said we believe in God's knowledge. We believe that his knowledge about this creation, he recorded it, but they deny his will and his creation of human actions. They believe that man is autonomous in his will and his own actions. So they assert a form of absolute free will for humans. We gave you the example of the Bedouin earlier. They say that the man is the sole author of their actions. They're independent actors outside of divine control, which is why it is narrated from some of the Salaf that they used to say, Al-Qadariyatu majusu hadhihi al-ummah. That the Qadariya, the free will absolutists, are the Magians of this ummah. Why? Because the Magians or Zoroastrians believed in a dual godhead, a god of good and a god of evil. kind of yin yang to action in life. One God affecting good, one God affecting evil. So essentially, we're positing two creators. Allah created the universe. We create our actions. And this is somewhat of an implicit polytheism, as some scholars have said. It's a very old belief. I think first promoted by Ma'bad al-Juhani, who a number of the later companions of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam disavowed. But we can see that to disbelieve in Qadr would be to reject the Hadith of Jibreel. To say that we are completely free will absolutists would deny the Quran and the Sunnah. To say that we are completely determinist, absolute determinists, or even limited determinists would also deny the Quran and the Sunnah. So we contradict scriptural evidence, we undermine the completeness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's knowledge and control, and we deny the ontological reality that He Himself has told us about Himself. That He has created everything, and He has given us choice within that creation, and He knows that creation. So this the deviation of the Qadariyya, of the free will absolutists, is an overcorrection in attempting to establish human moral responsibility. But it ends up compromising essential aspects of theology, essential aspects of our belief in Allah's divine attributes and His power. Just as the extreme determinism that we talked about does similar, but in the flip side. So let's wrap up. And I want to leave you with this. There's a lot more that can be said about this, but I think, this is just one line in Ibn Abi Dawud's poem. So we don't want to go too far. We want to establish that belief in Qadr is a profound and important pillar of Islamic belief. Okay. There are some of the beliefs of Qadr are, again, connected to conceptualizations of the universe and the nature of nature itself. Like, this is the physical universe, this is how it works. So, a lot of these debates that we're having, they go back to issues that are related to the epistemological, ontological, categories that were created around how people understood the world around them. And a lot of it going back to atomism, right? Atomism, Atomism. And the ideas of Ithbat al-Jawhar al-Fard, and can two atoms touch each other? All of these other kind of far out predilections about nature that were assumed but don't really hold. So even within like the later scientific period, determinism was kind of given a scientific veneer. So Newtonian determinism says that essentially we have no free will. Right? So if we're Isaac Newton and we're trying to figure out how the world, the universe works, we're going to look at all of the universe, all the cosmos, as like this giant clock that's wound up from the beginning of time, and it's just tick 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 ticking forward according to immutable physical laws of the universe. So every event follows inevitably from prior events. the initial conditions of the universe they set all future states. The nature of the universe essentially is static, and the laws of physics govern all processes without exception. So there's complete predictability, and the laws of physics can dictate all events. So if we believe that about the past, then that means that everything in the future is deterministic as well. So theoretically, we should be able to calculate what the future is with precision, because every motion and interaction follows mathematical laws. But what this does is does not leave any room for genuine randomness or choice. So as human beings, we simply become the product or the byproduct of prior physical states. Our consciousness, our choice, it's all an illusion. Our moral responsibility also comes into question, because if all actions are predetermined and someone murders someone, how can we hold them responsible for something that they were predetermined to do? How can they have moral responsibility for that which they had no choice in? So this type of Newtonian physics, or Newtonian determinism, was championed even by Einstein. So even the most morally weighted actions, like somebody killing someone, were predetermined by the initial conditions of the universe. So yeah, you could say such people could still face legal consequences, but their actions were inevitably outcomes of physical laws rather than the product of free choice. Now, everything from the movement of the planets to your next thought follows from necessarily follows from previous states. So this calls into question human agency, moral responsibility, the nature of consciousness itself. If every action is predetermined, can we assign meaning to concepts like choice and responsibility and moral judgment? We end up hedonists. It's a mechanistic worldview. And yes, it represents one spectrum in the debates about free will, right? Because it's setting up a tension between physical causation and human agency. But this was broken by Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. So there was challenges that were met. Challenges that this determinism, Newtonian determinism, Einsteinian determinism was met with. So Heisenberg, he basically came and he said, okay, I'm going to open up the door for free will in a universe previously thought to be entirely mechanical. So Heisenberg's idea was that at the quantum level, there's an inherent uncertainty in measuring certain pairs of physical properties simultaneously. So if we look at a particle, it's impossible to know both the precise position and momentum of a particle at any given time. At the same time, we can't know the precise position and momentum. So this uncertainty isn't due to the limitations in the measurement technology. It's a property of the fundamental feature of reality itself. And what this does is this challenges the idea of determinism in a few key ways. It challenges the idea that all future states can be calculated from initial conditions. It challenges the idea that everything is predictable. In fact, you could have genuine unpredictability, even in physical systems. And it belies the whole metaphor that this whole thing was built on, and that is that the world is just a giant clock that's been wound up. So this idea of quantum uncertainty opened up the debate on free will in two key ways. Number one is it broke the chain of determination, because pure determinism requires perfect predictability. But quantum uncertainty makes that impossible, which means that there's a space for genuine novelty and choice. And then it also allows a scientific basis for agency, because if the future cannot be precisely determined, then our choices may not be entirely predetermined. And that provides a potential physical basis for genuine free will. Now, we're talking completely in a materialistic sense here. We've already talked about what we believe as Muslims. So this direct challenge to Einstein and Newton's deterministic view essentially is saying that uncertainty and probability are fundamental features of reality, not just limitations of human knowledge. It doesn't completely prove the existence of free will in its absolute sense. If you're a kafir, right? If you're a disbeliever and you don't care anything about Islamic texts, or you're just playing that role and trying to posit that as a kalam exercise, right? You're not able to prove absolute free will. But it does demonstrate that the purely mechanistic view of the universe is incomplete, which means that if we live in a universe where fundamental uncertainty exists at a quantum level, strict determinism cannot hold true. And that opens the door for genuine choice and agency, even within a scientific framework. So essentially, we go from like three stages of this, right? So we go from Newtonian determinism to, quantum indeterminacy, where the act of observation itself changes what we're observing. Particles being able to exist in multiple possible positions until observed. What some have called, there's this introduces a wild card into the universe. It makes perfect prediction impossible, and it opens the doors to some kind of free will. So the third level of this tells us a little bit about the idea of free will. If I look in the mirror, if I look at myself in a mirror, and I see myself, I'm looking at myself in the camera, and I see myself in the camera. Okay, actually, I can't see myself in the camera because it's position. But if I'm seeing myself in a mirror and I see myself, then what I see is actually not me. It's me a billionth of a second ago, because it took a billionth of a second for the light to travel to the mirror and then travel back to me, which means there's an impossibility of perfect real-time knowledge. There's an inherent delay in observation, in any observation. And as the observer, there's somewhat of a role in affecting what I observe. The act of observation actually changes what we observe. So the future can't be rigidly predetermined because it contains inherent possibilities. So, as I said, while this doesn't show absolute free will, it does show some kind of free will, because it breaks the rigid chain of Newtonian causation. The universe is not a clock. It's not predetermined. There's genuine uncertainty at its most fundamental level. Now think about this. Let's go back to our garden example. Anyone inside the garden with me would not have the ability to make perfect time observations, because they're limited by perspective. Even if they're standing in front of the tree that I'm trying to climb, they're limited by the perspective of a skewed line of sight up the tree. So they cannot have perfect observation. But if we posited an observer from outside of the observable space, what could we say about that being ontologically? Self-observation takes, a billionth of a second. Even with second-party observation within the same system, there's a fundamental limitation on any observer within the system. But for an observer outside of the system, this maps to what we said about Allah's knowledge. It is complete and comprehensive. It is not bound by time. He knows everything that has happened, will happen, and could have happened. It's not limited by the constraints of observation. It's eternal and simultaneous. So this is, لا يخفى على الله شيء في الأرض ولا في السماء. Nothing is hidden from Allah in the earth or heaven. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's knowledge is eternal. يعلم ما في البر والبحر. He knows what is in the land and the sea. ما تسقط من ورقة إلا يعلمها. Not a leaf falls, but he knows it. So we as created beings have observational limitations because we're inside the fence. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is outside of. We already established this when we talked about the idea of al-ulu, when we talked about the idea of khalq, we talked about the idea of wahi, of nuzul al-wahi, all the idea of revelation, the idea of creation, the idea of ascendancy. We said that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is separate from his creation. He exists outside of the system that he created. You cannot go and say Allah is not up and not down and not here and not there. You can't have this negative theology and then actually affirm Allah. But we affirm to him what he affirmed to himself. So Allah's knowledge is fundamentally different from the knowledge of his creation. He does not acquire his knowledge through observation. This is why we say alim Allah, we don't say araf Allah. He's not bound by physical laws. So this is an interesting bridge between modern physics and classical Sunni theology. So our physical limitations still show us, the more that we learn about the universe, we don't have absolute free will, as there are laws within that universe, but there is uncertainty and indeterminacy at the quantum level that shows us that there are also wildcards that allow for free will and allow for that A/B testing to occur. So therefore, summing everything up, we've talked about the levels of Allah's knowledge. We've talked about the importance of Allah's knowledge, Allah's writing of what was to be in creation, Allah's willing it, and Allah's creating it. The affirmation of human agency, which is subordinate to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's will. The limitlessness of Allah's knowledge and power and creation, and the limited nature of man's comprehension, ability, and decision making. And so we ended with some commonalities between some, discussions about Newtonian physics and quantum physics and things like that. But we end again with what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying. لِمَنْ شَاءَ مِنْكُمْ أَنْ يَسْتَقِيمَ وَمَا تَشَاءُونَ إِلَّا أَنْ يَشَاءَ اللَّهُ رَبُّ الْعَالَمِينَ. For whoever wills amongst you to take the right course, and you do not will except that Allah wills. So while yes, that scientific discussion is purely materialistic, we ground human agency in a theological framework where choice exists within divine knowledge and decree. And so with that, we understand more about the idea of divine knowledge. Qadr is like climbing a tree blindfolded. And with that, inshallah ta'ala, we will conclude for the evening. And there's a lot more that we could talk about this topic. I mean, there's certain things that I didn't even cover here. Points of convergence and divergence between some of the scientific theories. We didn't talk about the ideas of like good and evil, human agency, accountability. We could have gone into a lot more about that. We could have talked about, shaitan and evil and the wisdom for allowing evil. But that is a longer discussion that I think needs dedicated time. I hope you benefited. And if I said anything correct, then it's from Allah. And if I said anything incorrect, then it's from myself and from shaitan. And I hope that you can overlook any of the shortcomings that have happened, and that you'll make dua for me and my teachers, my parents, my students, my children, and for yourselves. And inshallah ta'ala, we will see each other again next week, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala, when we will cover ahwal al-akhirah. So we'll start with the belief in the last day, which starts with the belief in munkar and nakir and the issues of the grave, and it goes all the way to one of the last things to happen in Jannah. And with that, we'll conclude. Sallallahu wa sallam ala nabiyyina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam tasliman kathira. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.